Hello and welcome to this fifth part of the series on worship. And I'm just concluding the little mini session on how to get into God's presence by looking at worship itself. What is it? Now, worship generally addresses the holiness of God. But what is holiness? In its most raw form, holiness is being separated. Under most circumstances, we cannot enter into God's presence due to sin in our lives. It might be deliberate sin, accidental sin, or sin we are completely unaware of. But with regard to getting into his presence, it doesn't matter to God. Sin is sin is sin. Hence, holiness as being separate. For good cannot mix with evil. This is why we are completely dependent on the work of the cross. In God's sight, we become the righteousness of Christ. 2 Corinthians 5:21. For he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. And that is that phenomenal exchange that happened through Jesus on the cross. And because of that, we can freely enter God's presence. We ourselves become a holy people in God's sight. Romans 12:1. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. Ephesians 1:4. Just as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and without blame before him in love. So worship biblically is what we should do when faced with the glory of God in his holiness, when faced with that perfectly perfect goodness, that complete absence of evil, when we are in his presence, not his normal day-to-day presence, but his special, intimate presence. Now, in a lot of instances of biblical worship, both Old Testament and New Testament, people fell down prostrate. Other times they bowed or knelt down. And that is where we should end up after the thanksgiving and praise. It is in the position of being prostrate, bowing or kneeling, that we truly worship God, that we know in our spirits that God is so close to us that we almost physically feel his presence. Our spirits become one with God's Spirit. And it's in this state of worship that God can much more easily talk to us in ways we can grasp and understand. Remember, God is the God who loves to reveal himself to us. For the whole of the Bible is about how God continually reveals himself to us and endeavours to be with us. All the way through the Bible, God is trying to establish a relationship with his creation and with us. From Genesis 1 to Revelation 22, God is busy trying to get us to be with him to such an extent that he more often than not visits us in many ways. Walking with Adam in the Garden of Eden, in angelic form to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, in the tabernacle in the time of from Moses to David, in the temple from Solomon to the exile, in the form of Jesus, in the form of his Holy Spirit present with us now, and finally in the future when Jesus returns and we are resurrected. However God chooses to presence himself with us, we always have the option to worship our God, and it's always our choice. We can never be forced to worship God. That would be such a gross violation of godly principles. Now there is a connection between worship and serving. Deuteronomy 6:13 and Matthew 4:10. Then Jesus said to him, Away with you, Satan, for it is written, You shall worship the Lord our God, and him only you shall serve. So out of worship, we should serve or do good things, Remember, faith without action or deeds is dead. You read that in James 2:17. But we should never do things because it makes us feel good, or because it would help us to feel needed, or even because, if no one else will do it, that others will suffer. I have seen a multitude of wrong reasons for why people do things, though, if I'm honest, I believe that most of us do the things we do for mixed reasons. The Bible tells us that we should do things as unto the Lord, and that's in Colossians 3:23. John 4:24, God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. And this is saying that God requires it to be an act of our spirits that worships. In other words, not merely an outward appearance that may be trying to impress others, but that it must come from deep within us, from our hearts. There must be no pretense, nothing false in our worship. God knows our innermost thoughts and will not be happy with hypocrisy. Also, we have an enemy who comes to steal and destroy, especially any attempts we make to connect with God. Hence, the singing of thanksgiving and praise will be targeted. Though we must never forget that greater is he that is in me than he that is in the world. And that concludes this episode. Thank you and goodbye.